Ladies and gentlemen, here she is, the girl with no guests at her own graduation. My uncle's voice boomed as his phone camera zoomed in on me, sitting stiffly in the second row of folding chairs in the echoing auditorium, surrounded by emptiness that rang louder than the canned applause playing from the speakers. And in that moment, my chest burned with humiliation so sharp, it felt like the tassel on my cap was a noose rather than a ribbon, because while every other student was engulfed in hugs, flowers, and teary parents with balloons, I was a silent island, my brow barren, my seat a spotlight of shame, and I knew that years from now, the clip he was recording wouldn't be remembered as a proud family keepsake, but as a cruel punchline. Proof that my own blood had chosen to let me stand alone, and what they didn't realize was that the same emptiness they left me in would one day come back for them, and I would be the one filming. I sat there frozen, my hands pressed into the fabric of my gown, nails biting through the thin polyester as if holding on to something would stop me from shattering. And the truth was, I wasn't even surprised. Not really, because my family had been preparing me for this moment for years, training me to expect absence disguised as punishment, silence dressed up as discipline, and cruelty delivered with a smile they called love. And yet seeing every other row filled with clusters of families holding signs and gifts made the hole in my chest gape wider. Because when I was a child, I believed that if I just studied harder, smiled wider, and swallowed my anger quieter, they would finally decide I was worthy of showing up. But all I got instead were lectures about being too sensitive and warnings that if I wanted respect, I had to earn it by never demanding it, and graduation was the perfect battlefield for them, a moment they knew mattered to me, where their absence would be louder than any insult, and they weaponized that silence, like experts, leaving me under the glaring fluorescent lights. My cap tilted slightly crooked from where my trembling hands had adjusted it too many times, while rows of parents clapped so hard for children who had done no more, no less than I had, except their victories were validated, celebrated, immortalized, while mine was erased in real time, broadcast on my uncle's camera not as a triumph, but as proof that their neglect had finally broken me down. And I could feel their fingerprints on this humiliation, even though they weren't in the room, because the absence itself was their presence, deliberate and sharp, and I swore then with my breath lodged like glass in my throat that one day I would stop begging them to see me and start showing them what it looks like when the girl they left alone decides she doesn't need them at all. When the ceremony ended and the caps flew into the air like fireworks, mine slipped from my fingers too late, fluttering crookedly and falling at my feet, just like the rest of me had in that moment. But I forced my lips into a smile because my uncle's camera was still rolling, and the last thing I would give them was the satisfaction of seeing me cry. I gathered my empty arms, while others were heavy with bouquets and gift bags, and walked slowly out of the auditorium, the echo of cheers not meant for me sticking to my skin like static. And as I pushed through the double doors into the summer, heat. I remembered every promise my mother had ever broken, every excuse about money or being too busy, even though I knew she had taken my younger cousin shopping that same day, dressing her up like a doll for Instagram likes. And I thought of my father, who claimed work came first, but still found time to attend poker nights with his friends. And of my siblings, who treated me like the family's unpaid babysitter, like my only worth was covering their responsibilities so they could enjoy their lives. And all of it funneled into this one moment, standing outside with no one waiting for me, no car honking with balloons tied to the mirror, no warm arms rushing to wrap me up, just the wide, empty parking lot shimmering with heat, my uncle leaning against his car with his phone still out, smirking, saying, "Smile, at least you'll have a funny story someday." And I wanted to scream, but I didn't, because deep inside a shift was happening, a quiet snapping sound in my chest where hope had lived, and in its place a cold, steady determination grew, whispering that if they could treat me like a ghost on the most important day of my life, then I could learn to haunt them, and that ghosts they had created would follow them, not me, until they finally realized what it feels like to be unseen, unwanted, and unforgettable for all the wrong reasons. I walked home that day, still in my gown, heels clicking against the cracked sidewalks, because of course no one thought to offer me a ride, and with every step I replayed years of evidence, little. Fragments of the truth I had been too loyal, too hopeful to admit. The birthday parties they skipped because gas was too expensive, only for me to see the photos later of them at barbecues across town, the times I stayed up tutoring my younger cousin through algebra while her parents went out, only to be mocked as the nerd no one wanted to sit with, the holidays where they let me cook and clean for everyone else, then laughed when I got too tired to sit and enjoy family time, as if my exhaustion was comedy instead of sacrifice, and graduation was simply the crescendo of that long, humiliating symphony they'd been composing out of my patience, my silence, my love. And as I passed the corner store with my tassel brushing against my cheek, I realized for the first time that I didn't owe them anything anymore, that I had been living like an unpaid actor in their play, performing obedience, gratitude, and forgiveness in exchange for scraps of approval they never intended to give. And the more I thought about it, the straighter my spine grew, because the power in walking alone wasn't weakness, it was clarity. And by the time I reached my building, clutching my diploma in its cheap leather folder, I knew that this was going to be my first and last act of begging for them to care, because from this moment forward, I wasn't the family's scapegoat, errand girl, or punching bag. I was the woman who had survived their neglect and was strong enough to turn it into a weapon. And while they might have laughed at the footage of me standing alone in that auditorium, what they didn't know was that I was already planning the day when I would make them feel that same hollow emptiness, when the roles would be reversed and they would be the ones left staring at empty seats, wondering how it felt to be invisible at an event they thought they controlled. It didn't take long for that day to come, because life has a way of folding back on itself, and while my diploma didn't come with confetti or applause, it did come with the one thing none of them expected me to have: options. And I grabbed them with both hands. I threw myself into work, late nights at the library, internships no one believed I'd land, jobs they sneered at as beneath me, until they realized I was stacking experience like bricks, building a foundation out of everything they had denied me, and slowly, piece by piece, I carved out a life without them in it. But here's the thing about families who only value control: they don't notice you're gone until they need something. And that's exactly what happened the first time they called me out of the blue, voices suddenly dripping with fake sweetness, saying my younger cousin was applying to college and needed help with her essay. And wasn't I always so good with words? And for the first time in my life, I didn't swallow my anger or say yes. I let the silence stretch, long and uncomfortable, before I told them that my calendar was full, my time too valuable, and hung up. And the sting in their tone when they realized I wasn't bending anymore was like oxygen to me. But that was just the beginning, because the more I grew, the more desperate they became. Requests for money when bills piled up, demands that I attend birthdays to show support, even an outright plea that I move back home to help care for an elderly relative, as if the years of absence could be erased with one guilt trip. And each time I refused, I could feel the power shifting, see the cracks in their smug facade, until the day my uncle, the same one who filmed me alone at graduation, stood in front of me at a family gathering I had agreed to attend for the first time in years, and tried to joke, "Remember when you had no one show up? That was wild." And instead of shrinking or laughing along, I locked eyes with him, let the silence hang heavy, and said, "Yes, I remember. Do you?" And for the first time in my life, it wasn't me who looked small. It was him, his smirk faltering, his voice stammering, because the girl he once mocked in an empty auditorium wasn't standing there anymore. She had turned into the woman who carried the weight of their absence like armor, and they were finally starting to realize that the emptiness they gave me had become the void where their influence used to live. After that day, it was like dominoes falling. One by one, they kept coming back, circling around me not because they wanted me, but because they needed me, and I never forgot the difference. My mother called one evening, her voice quivering just enough to sound rehearsed, telling me she wished she had been at my graduation. But things had been complicated, and I let her talk, listening to the excuses roll out like cheap fabric, each thread weaker than the last, until she finally asked if I could help her cover rent because she was between jobs, and I said calmly, "I know what it feels like to need someone and have no one show up. I think you'll manage," before hanging up, and the silence that followed wasn't mine to carry anymore. It was hers. My father tried next, inviting me to a poker night as though 10 years of skipped milestones could be patched with stale beer and cigarette smoke. And when I didn't even respond, he left a message saying he had always been proud of me. But the words came too late, and I didn't give him the satisfaction of answering, because pride without presence is worthless. Then came my siblings, who had once treated me like a servant, now suddenly eager to reconnect, slipping into my messages with reminders of childhood memories, carefully staged photos of their kids, and finally, bluntly, requests for babysitting, or help paying for braces. And each time I left them on read, the same way they had left me alone in that auditorium. And the irony wasn't lost on me. The final crack came at a family reunion I hadn't planned to attend, but showed up to anyway, dressed sharp, standing tall, and when I walked into that rented hall full of folding chairs and paper lanterns, the same setting where I had once been the forgotten girl, every head turned, every voice dropped, because they didn't expect me to come back stronger, didn't expect me to hold their neglect in my hands like evidence, didn't expect me to stand at the center of the room, without needing anyone beside me. And when my uncle raised his phone again, maybe out of old habit, I smiled directly into the lens and said, "Go ahead, film me now. Make sure you capture what survival looks like." And this time, the silence that followed wasn't humiliating, it was power. Because they all knew the girl they abandoned at graduation had grown into the woman who no longer needed a single one of them to applaud. The more I pulled back, the clearer the picture became. My family had always mistaken my silence for weakness. But it was never weakness. It was data. And I had been collecting it my whole life. Every missed recital, every empty chair at every milestone, every smirk at my expense, storing them like receipts. And now that I had proof stacked higher than their excuses, I no longer flinched when they tried to rewrite the past. My uncle, the one who filmed my empty graduation, sent me a friend request on social media. And when I ignored it, he messaged me directly, writing, "We should laugh about that day sometime. It wasn't that serious," as though humiliation could be softened into humor with the right spin. And I replied once, a single sentence. It was serious enough to remember forever. And then blocked him, feeling lighter than I ever had. My mother's voice began to soften in every voicemail, sliding from defensive to pitiful, until one day she admitted that people in the community had started to ask questions. Why I never came home, why I never posted family photos, why they never appeared at any of my achievements. And suddenly, the weight of their absence wasn't just mine, it was theirs, because their neglect had become their reputation, and there was no way to edit that truth. And while they scrambled, I kept building, climbing my career ladder rung by rung, investing carefully, surrounding myself with friends who showed up without needing to be begged. And for the first time in my life, I realized I wasn't just surviving without them. I was thriving because of it, because their refusal to celebrate me had forced me to learn how to celebrate myself. And once I mastered that, there was nothing they could take from me anymore. No silence loud enough to shake me, no absence sharp enough to cut me, because the girl they left to stand alone in an auditorium had finally learned what it meant to stand on her own. And once you learn that, you never kneel again. The shift became undeniable the day I bought my own home, keys clinking in my palm. As I stepped into the space I had earned entirely on my own, no cosigner, no family help, no borrowed money, just me, my work, and the determination they had mocked. The walls were bare at first, but even the emptiness felt warm, because it was mine. And as I unpacked boxes, I thought of that auditorium again, the rows of parents with arms full of flowers, and I realized I had finally given myself what they never did, a place where I belonged, a seat reserved just for me. And not long after, word must have traveled back to them, because the calls started again, this time laced with envy disguised as pride. "We heard you bought a house. We're so proud of you," my mother said, as if she had contributed a single brick. And when I didn't respond, she added softly, "We'd love to see it sometime." But the truth was, she had already seen. Enough. She had seen what her absence built, and she didn't like the reflection. My siblings came next, suddenly eager to throw family dinners, each invite a transparent attempt to step back into my orbit, now that it glowed brighter than theirs, and I declined each one with the same line. I'm busy building my life, because I was, every day, laying down new foundations of freedom, and it burned them that they couldn't take credit for any of it. The final proof came at a wedding, when I showed up, not for them, but for a childhood friend. And as I walked into that crowded reception hall wearing a gown that fit me like armor, my uncle, yes, the same one, pointed at me from across the room and muttered to someone at his table, "She thinks she's better than us now." And I didn't flinch, didn't shrink, didn't argue, because the truth was I didn't need to think it. I knew it. And the difference between us was now carved into every decision they had made to not show up, every cruel smirk they thought I'd forget, every silent seat they left empty. And while they were still stuck defending their neglect with jokes and excuses, I was living proof that the girl they abandoned had turned into a woman whose success was their greatest punishment. It was almost poetic when life handed me the perfect mirror, because one by one their children began to reach milestones, graduations, recitals, birthdays, and I noticed the same patterns playing out, but this time with me on the other side of the invitations, because suddenly I was the relative they wanted front and center, the aunt who should clap loudest, the cousin who should bring gifts, the success story they could parade as proof the family had raised someone worthy. And that's when I understood the cruelest irony of all. They didn't want me there for me. They wanted me there to fix the gaps they had left, to cover their shame with my presence, to rewrite the narrative that they had been supportive all along, and I refused to give them that cover. I skipped the events they begged me to attend, and when questioned, I answered with the same line they had once given me. I had other priorities, and I let the sting land exactly where it belonged, because nothing cuts deeper than hearing your own excuses thrown back at you. The day my cousin graduated, my mother called 3 times, leaving increasingly desperate voicemails. "She'll be heartbroken if you're not here. She looks up to you." But I didn't move, didn't answer, didn't step foot in that auditorium. And when I later saw the photos online, her standing stiffly, arms empty, the family scattered, no balloons, no flowers, I felt that strange blend of sadness and satisfaction. Because while I never wanted her to feel the sting I had, I knew the lesson wasn't mine to protect her from, it was theirs, the older generation who thought their neglect would never echo. And now they were living inside that same echo chamber they built for me, staring at the same empty chairs while I, the forgotten girl, had become the one person they couldn't ignore anymore. Not because I demanded their attention, but because my absence was finally louder than their presence had ever been. Years passed, and the distance between us became more than just physical. It was measured in choices, in the way I no longer flinched when their names appeared on my phone, in the freedom I felt walking into rooms that had nothing to do with them, surrounded instead by people who showed up without conditions, without keeping score. My career flourished, promotions came, and each time I achieved something worth celebrating, I created my own rituals. Dinners with friends, solo trips, framed photos of myself holding the milestones they never witnessed, because I had finally learned that validation given by others can be snatched away, but the kind you build within yourself is permanent, indestructible. Meanwhile, they crumbled, slowly, visibly, their confidence unraveling as their control over me slipped through their fingers, and I began to hear whispers through extended relatives, messages carefully delivered through mutual acquaintances, about how it wasn't fair that I held grudges, about how family is all you really have, about how they did their best, as though the decades of absence could be rewritten with one pity-soaked narrative. And I didn't bite, because I remembered too clearly the sound of my uncle's laughter as he filmed me standing alone at graduation, the way my mother brushed off her absence with a shrug, the way my siblings rolled their eyes every time I asked for the smallest sliver of support. And I knew these weren't people who had done their best. They were people who had done what was easiest for themselves, no matter the cost to me. The real breaking point came when a health scare rattled through the family, suddenly pulling them together in panic. And once again they turned to me, not out of love but out of expectation, assuming that the girl they left behind would still come running when needed. And this time, instead of silence, I gave them words as sharp as the years I carried. "You left me alone when I needed you most. Now you'll learn how it feels." And the phone went quiet, their shock palpable even through the static, because they had always believed I would bend, that blood would tether me no matter how many times they cut the cord, but they underestimated the power of survival, of turning wounds into armor, and as I hung up, a weight slid off me that I hadn't even realized I was still carrying. I wasn't their scapegoat anymore. I wasn't their filler. I wasn't the insurance policy they thought they could cash in whenever life turned cruel. I was the consequence of their choices, the living reminder that neglect has a price, and they were finally paying it in full, seated in the same emptiness they once forced me into, only now it wasn't my humiliation echoing in the silence. It was theirs. And I walked forward into a future where I no longer needed to prove myself to anyone, least of all, to the people who once filmed my loneliness as entertainment. And so the girl who once stood in that echoing auditorium, clutching a diploma with no one there to clap, grew into a woman who understood that love without presence is nothing, that family without loyalty is just a title, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is walk away and never look back. I built my life brick by brick, not with their help, but in spite of their absence. And every success was sweeter because it was mine alone, untouched by their neglect, untainted by their excuses. And when I think back now to that video my uncle filmed, the one meant to embarrass me, I realize it was never a humiliation. It was proof, a record of the moment I was set free, because the silence of that day taught me that I would never again beg to be seen, never again twist myself into knots to be worthy of love that should have been unconditional, never again accept scraps when I deserved a feast. And while they still live in the shadows of their own choices, circling among themselves, replaying the same cycles of neglect and denial, I live in the light of my own making, surrounded by people who choose me every single day. I no longer need their apologies, their explanations, or their presence, because the only thing their absence gave me was the chance to become someone stronger than they ever imagined. And that strength is the revenge they never saw coming. The knowledge that they don't get to define me, that their laughter, their silence, their smirks are nothing compared to the power of a life lived fully, freely, joyfully, on my own terms. And now, whenever I hear the words ladies and gentlemen, I don't think of an empty graduation. I think of the introduction to my own story, the one I tell myself every day, the story of how being left with 0 guests was the beginning, of becoming my own best company, my own loudest cheer, my own family. And no matter how much they might wish to rewrite the past, the truth is unshakable. I didn't lose them that day. They lost me, and they will never get me back.